Go ahead, Srija. We have an interesting subject, restructuring, and it's a very wide area. I have chosen a few case studies. I'm sure we are not going to be able to discuss all of them in the course of this talk, but I think it will give a fair idea of the depth of the subject, the variety, the number of issues which can come up, and the various uses which we can make of this subject. Because this is one part of tax law, company law, stamp duty law, FEMA, call it what you like, because all of them are implied or have some implication somewhere or the other, which perhaps has the maximum flexibility even today. Most of the other parts of the tax law are straitjacketed. You have had years of judicial experience, exposure, telling you exactly what you can do or you cannot do in relation to normal modes of taxation. This is one of the few areas where there is still some scope for innovation, some scope for new thinking, some scope for doing something differently. And there are enough permutations and combinations which we can apply. And that is one of the reasons why it's one of the most interesting areas to deal with. Currently, I thought of dealing with it in 2 or 3 broad areas. The first broad area is the recent changes in the finance, in the manner in which companies are taxed, not by the Finance Act, but a little earlier to the Finance Act, the 115BAA and BAB, the reduced rate of taxation. So I thought that may involve a number of cases where restructuring is involved. Then comes COVID, Corona, call it what you like. In general, we had financial problems and a degree of financial distress even before that. So in any case, one of the answers to financial distress and problems is restructuring. It is an undesirable word. I will not use the word bad word, but an undesirable word in the legal or the financial context. No bank, no NBFC wants to say that they have restructured the loan. They are looking for various exemptions to what is called restructuring and what is not. But we are not talking about restructuring of loans. We are talking about restructuring of companies and entities, which is again a necessary part of dealing with financial distress. The other major area today is the attempt, A, at an individual level and B, at a corporate level, if possible, to leave this country. We are talking, of course, in a time when we are talking about Atmanirbhar Bharat and Swabhiman. But unfortunately, the rules, the regulations, the tax laws, and a variety of other constraints give one the feeling that if he can do the same thing from outside India, as opposed to doing it from India, he will be better off. And therefore this attempt, also because the financial markets are deeper, wider, better, so you can raise resources more easily. There are a variety of areas where people are willing to take risks. There is risk capital available, there is normal capital available. So a variety of reasons why corporates want to leave this country and families also want to leave this country or hold their wealth abroad. And therefore externalization is the other trend which I thought I would try and cover. There are a number of other trends. It's not possible to cover all of them. For example, listing, delisting is one possible trend, and so on. So I thought I would try and deal with these trends in the course of today, and therefore deal with them through case studies rather than deal with them as a subject. We could have dealt with them as a subject, dealing with the section, the rules, the provisions, and how one can deal with each one of them or apply them, and what are the issues in applying them. It's virtually the same thing. It's perhaps easier to understand or easier to appreciate if we are looking at it in the form of a case study. And therefore, I thought I would use this format. We will, if the organizers want to permit that, at the end, find a way to have Q&A for a few minutes. So in case you have queries, we should be able to try and deal with that. Turning to the first subject, therefore, the first subject is the amendment in the tax rates 115 BAA, one of the greatest amendments in that sense, reducing the effective tax rate to 22 or rather 25%, because surcharge and cess are a part of life in the country. So it's not 22, it's 25. But that's also a reasonable rate. Is it sufficiently reasonable? Question mark. If you look at UK, they are willing to tax companies at 18 and 19%. If you look at USA, they are willing to tax companies at around the same, between 18 and 22%. Most of the other countries are willing to tax at more or less this levels. In India, you have this plus the dividend tax. There is no dividend distribution tax anymore, but shareholders pay a tax. And that tax can be as high as 35.88%. So 36%. On the balance, 75%. Roughly another 26, 27%. So if you look at it that way, the combined tax can be as high as 52, 53%. So it's not very cheap. But for somebody who's been used to say 35, 40% rate of tax, it's a great relief that it is 25. So it's not a big bonanza, and yet it is a big bonanza. That's the way to look at it. The point is, if you want to take advantage of this bonanza, what do you do? Shrija? So what we are thinking of is, let's say there is a company which was in existence for over 10 years, and it has got operations, its old plant making pipes, and a new plant dealing with water supply and irrigation projects. The new business is entitled to ATIA. ATIA is available for 10 years. 2-3 years have passed, another 7 years are there. So it is a benefit which is valuable because it's something which they can enjoy for a reasonable length of time. And they were there before the sunset, so they are now still entitled to it. It is a profitable company. And the question is, they want to shift and take advantage of the lower rate of tax. Now the effective tax rate, if you combine the old unit, the non-ATIA unit and the ATIA unit, is perhaps in the same range of 25 or even lesser, 20, 22, because you pay no tax on the ATIA unit and you pay tax at 35% on the non-ATIA. But if you can pay tax at 25 on non-ATIA and pay 0 on ATIA, that's even better. Then your average rate comes down even further. And therefore the objective is, how do we achieve that? Yeah. So what are the ways? Currently, if you shift to the 25% rate of tax, if you opt, if you opt for 115 BAA, then it must apply to the entire income of the company. It cannot apply to a part. And you cannot take ATIA benefit anymore. Various deductions and allowances are prohibited. One of them prohibited is ATIA. So the company would not be able to enjoy the lower rate of tax if it continues as a combined company. So you need to separate. You need to find a way in which the ATIA unit is in one company and the non-ATIA unit is in another company. In that case, the company with the non-ATIA unit can go for the lower rate of tax, can go for 25, and there will be no loss of any benefit because that company has no other benefit. And the company which has got the benefit, which has got the ATIA unit, will continue to claim ATIA. It will not go for the lower rate of tax, But when you are paying zero, there is no question of a lower rate of tax. Zero remains zero. So both units benefit, and we may merge them after another 10 years or another 6, 7 years back again, if it makes sense to merge them again, because at that point of time, this unit will also start paying 35%. And when it starts paying 35, you will shift to 25% and merge them. Of course, all that assumes that tax laws will remain constant for 6, 7 years or more. And that's a very tall ask. So in any case, thinking of what you will do after that point of time is just enough to just think and leave it, because in all probability, you will be dealing with a different tax regime, and you will then decide what you want to do on that day. As far as today is concerned, your question is, how do I separate the ATIA unit and the non-ATIA unit? What are the options available to me? The options, amongst others, are a demerger and a slump transfer. So you can either transfer the business. You can, of course, transfer the business on an itemized sale. It's included in slump transfer in the way in which we are thinking of it. So you can either transfer the business by selling, by gifting, by exchange, or you can go through a demerger, which is a corporate restructuring route. So either you use that route or you use a slump transfer route. You can apply it either to the ATIA unit or you can apply it to the non-ATIA unit. But you have to divide the two. You have to make one company into two. So what are the methods available to us? We are going to deal with each one of them separately. So let's go ahead. Coming to demerger first. We could demerge, if we are doing it with NCLT approval, we can only demerge the non-ATIA unit. We cannot demerge the ATIA unit. We cannot do that because if we attempt to demerge the ATIA unit, we will lose the benefit of ATIA. There is section 12, capital A, 12A of subsection 12A of ATIA, which says that in the event of an amalgamation or a demerger, the provisions of subsection 12 will not apply. Subsection 12 says that in the event of an amalgamation or demerger, the amalgamated company will enjoy the benefit and the earlier amalgamating company, in a sense, will not get the benefit. That was logical. You are only deciding which of the two will get. You are saying you will not split it on time basis and give 3 months to one and 9 months to another. The provision which says that in the case of an amalgamation or demerger, you will just not give the benefit has no logic. Because on the one hand, you have a board circular which says the benefit goes with the undertaking. If you transfer the undertaking, the new owner will get the benefit. And that's an accepted position. It has been accepted since the days of ATJ. We are talking about the last 25, 30 years. So it's something which in a sense has been accepted for new industrial undertakings. They have always enjoyed some kind of tax benefit. It's only now that we intend to stop this tax benefit altogether by reducing the effective rate of tax. And always it has been that this benefit to which they are entitled, whatever be the section through which they are entitled, is a benefit which is available to the undertaking, not necessarily to the assessee. And therefore, undertakings can go from A to B, the benefit will continue in the hands of B. If that is true, why not allow it on a demerger? No logic, no reason, no justification. The explanatory memorandum, which board circulars explaining the provisions, nobody tells you why. And this is not something which was covered in the FM speech of that year. This was in 87, most probably, that this amendment was brought. Nobody has challenged it as to whether the correct interpretation of 12A is 12 does not apply. And if 12 does not apply, all that it means is both the amalgamating company and amalgamated company, or the demerging company and the resulting company, should get the benefit, and that should continue. It's not really been challenged. People have taken the safe route out, find alternatives, find another way to restructure. Why take a risk on something which litigation will decide only after 10 or 15 years, and by then your ATIA would in any case be over. So you can't do it. So what do? You demerge the non-ATIA unit. Now, why is demerger good? And I have got a slide with dealing with it little later. But the whole idea is a compliant demerger has tremendous benefits. It is tax-free, it is free from any dividend tax, and so on. It's free from capital gains tax, it's exempt under 56. Are these benefits required to be stated in the law? We'll come back to that also. I'm not so sure that a compliant demerger is a must to get all those benefits. So we'll come back to these two positions. But first, if you do with an NCLT approval, if you demerge the non-ATIA business, it has to be the business as a going concern. It cannot be a set of assets. It has to be the undertaking. If you demerge the undertaking, you will get the benefit, and therefore that is why you use the demerger route. Effectively, it's tax neutral. And in the process, you might be able to save on stamp duty if there is a concessional rate. For example, in Maharashtra, the rate would be 0.7% on the value of the shares allotted. Whereas a conveyance of movables also would have a stamp duty of 3%. Immovables, you may still have to pay even under a demerger. You may have to do that separately because the rate is 0.7, or the amount payable on the immovables, whichever is higher. So the immovables in any case are chargeable. That is the broad position. Go on. The other alternative, if you don't want to do through the NCLT route, which is required for it to be compliant. And why do you not want NCLT? Because it's a complex procedure and it takes time. It can be over in 3 months. We have done that in 3 months in our office, but it can take 6 months. It can take a year. You cannot predict. It may be, you may be unfortunate that on the day when your hearing is coming up, the bench is not functioning and your matter gets adjourned immediately by a month or 2. You may be unfortunate for a variety of reasons. The DR may take adjournment, somebody else may take adjournment. God knows what happens. You have an overburdened NCLT. The government is aware of that. They have put the whole IBC on NCLT. They have put IBC as a priority. They want NCLT to deal with it. They want NCLT to deal with a variety of other laws, and they want them to deal with company law. They want to deal with, say, an operation and mismanagement application under company law. They want to deal with mergers and demergers under company law. You don't have enough members, enough benches, enough infrastructure. There is a significant improvement over the time when in Mumbai, it was impossible to reach the NCLT bench for the simple reason that you had to have the same tough stamina which you need to enter a good local train. You have to really fight your way into the courtroom because it is so crowded, more crowded than a normal local train. And then therefore, if at the time when your matter is heard, being called out, if you can't reach the bench, bad luck. So that was the type of situation. So rather than that, if you want to avoid NCLT, then you can think of a demerger without NCLT approval. Is it possible? So what I'm trying to say is Section 180 of the Companies Act talks of sale or transfer of an undertaking. So if there is an undertaking of the business of the company, and in this case, it's the non-ATIA unit, if there is an undertaking which is being transferred, you need to go under Section 181A and get a special resolution. And it talks of the procedure which you must follow. The important part is subsection 4 of this section. It's very rarely used. Subsection subsection 4 of 180 says that in a resolution under 180 whereby you get the approval to transfer the unit, to sell the unit for the price and for whatever terms at which you want to do it, the shareholders can also lay down conditions about the use, the disposal, or the investment of the sale proceeds. So the shareholders could say, transfer the undertaking and donate the sale proceeds to charity. Don't touch them. The company can't get the money. The company must transfer the undertaking, but the money must go to charity simultaneously. So it's up to the shareholders to decide the use, the disposal, or the investment of the sale proceeds. It's up to them. It's not a must. And that's why I said it's rarely used. Normally, shareholders only approve the transfer and leave it to the board of directors and the company to do what they like with the sale proceeds and deal with them in the normal course of the company as one of the assets of the company. But they can. They have a power. And there is a proviso added to that clause. The proviso to subsection 4 is to the effect that you can do what you like under subsection 4. You can direct how you will deal with the proceeds, but you cannot direct a reduction of capital. So in short, the proviso assumes that one of the things you can direct is that this will be given away to the shareholders. It can be cash which is distributed, if there are sale proceeds are in cash, or if the sale proceeds are in kind, in the form of shares of the resulting company, it can be the shares. The shareholders can direct that on the transfer, the new co, as in this case, will allot shares, and those shares will go directly to the shareholders of the company. Those shares will never reach the company. The company will have no say in the matter. The board of directors will have no say in the matter, because subsection 4 gives this power to the shareholders to direct. And if the shareholders direct, then that is what naturally will govern, because that the act gives them the power and you are using that power. In this case, of course, you can't reduce stamp duty by that 0.7% rule, because the 0.7% rule type of concession, depending on the state in which you are, is applicable only to an actual tribunal order or a court order. It used to be court orders and now NCLT orders. It would not apply to a transfer under a resolution of shareholders. So therefore, it would be a conveyance, and the normal stamp duty applied to a conveyance would apply here. The normal planning for stamp duty in the context of transfer of businesses, which is part of restructuring, is to say that you enter into an agreement to sell. You don't enter into an agreement of sale. So you say, okay, I will sell this business to you on, say, 30 days from today. So you put in a future date and you say, I will sell this to you. How will I sell? So I will give you control, I will transfer, I will give you. How? So it provides that of all the movables, I'll give you possession. So the inventory will physically be shifted to you. Of all the intangibles, I will give you rights. I will, for example, tell a debtor that he should not pay me, he should pay you. So we will be doing novation with the debtors. And the only thing which we will do an actual document is for the immovable property, or say a trademark or a patent. If you cannot achieve the transfer of immovable property or a trademark or a patent without a written document which is registered. If that be the law, for that particular item, you will do a document. For everything else, you will transfer otherwise. Now, if you transfer by just handing over, are you liable to stamp duty? The answer is no. Are you liable to stamp duty on the agreement to sell? Normally, the agreement to sell has a much lower stamp duty. It used to be 100 rupees or 500 rupees. Now it is 0.1, 0.2, but it is nowhere near 3 and 5%. It is still 0.1, 0.2. So you are talking about lower stamp duty by structuring your sale document. You will have tax issues because this will be held to be a non-compliant demerger. Should there be tax issues or not is something which we will discuss as we go forward. Yeah. So what are the issues here? As we have said, if we go without NCLT approval, can any questions arise? One is what I have already discussed. The second bullet is what I discussed, the subsection 4, which talks of you can stipulate conditions, including conditions regarding the use, disposal, or investment of sale proceeds. And reduction of capital is not permitted. Coming to the other problem, Section 123, subsection 5, prohibits distribution of dividend in kind. Dividend can only be in cash by a company. Point is, what is this agreement which you are going to do under 180? Your agreement is going to be Company A will sell the non-80IA unit to Company B. Company B in turn will allot shares directly to all the shareholders of Company A. That is your agreement. Company B is not giving anything to its shareholders. Sorry, Company A is not giving anything to its shareholders. It is only transferring the unit to Company B, and Company B is giving to the shareholders of A. It is not giving anything to its own shareholders. So neither company is giving anything to its shareholders. There is no dividend involved in the process. But if you were to look at it in substance, can you say that effectively Company A is distributing the value of the unit or the unit to its shareholders, combined jointly to all the shareholders? And if this is a distribution of the unit, it's a dividend. Or can you say that Company A is entitled to the shares of Company B, that this is an exchange, the unit is exchanged for new shares, and the shares are being distributed, and that distribution is a dividend. If that distribution is a dividend, it is prohibited by the Companies Act. You can't do it. The Bombay High Court has said so in the context of Indian Seamless earlier. So that was under the 1956 Act, but the position remains same. The better view is this is not a dividend. And even if it is a dividend, when Section 180 clearly gives the power to the shareholders to do what they like with the sale proceeds, then it must be held that that power overrules 123. If you have a conflict between two sections of the Companies Act, naturally the one which is beneficial, the one which is more acceptable to you is the one which will govern. So whichever way you want to look at it, the limitations of 123 should not come in the way. Go on. Then what are the other consequences? And the other consequences, as I said, are basically tax. Is this something which amounts to a capital gain? Will there be a transfer? Is that a sale? That is the question. Is it in the hands of the company? Or is there overriding title? And therefore, would you say the company gets nothing and therefore is not chargeable? So the unit is transferred. The consideration is in the form of shares, but the shares are not coming to Company A at all. They are directly going to the shareholders. If they are directly going to the shareholders, can you say there is a diversion by overriding title? And if there is a diversion by overriding title, then there is no income, because no consideration accrues to you, no consideration is received by you, no consideration is there with the company. So that is one possible reason why the company is not taxable. Another possible reason is, and now what is a slump exchange and what's the difference? What you're giving away is the unit of business as a whole and undertaking. So it's a slump item. It is not subdivided, it's not bits and pieces, it's not parts, it's not plant, it's not machinery, it's not land, the building, each one separately. It's all combined as a going concern. So it is slump. And exchange, because you are not getting cash. If you get money, it's a sale. But if you get anything in kind, it's a barter. It's an exchange. And a barter is not sale. Here you are giving it, and in exchange you are getting shares. So it's a slump exchange, it is not a slump sale. Section 50 capital B of the Income Tax Act has a special formula of how to determine capital gains, but it applies only to a slump sale. It does not apply to a slump exchange. So therefore, the company may not be liable to capital gains even on this ground. Will there be dividend in the hands of the shareholders? The other question. As I said a minute back, it is not a dividend. Company A is giving nothing to its shareholders. Company B is giving nothing to its own shareholders. Company B is giving something to the shareholders of Company A. That is not a dividend. If you are reading through the language and saying that this is as good as Company B giving it to Company A and Company A distributing, then you are looking at the substance, but that is not the form. Now, why are you doing this? You are doing this because shareholders have a power to direct, and they are directing. So if somebody else has a power to direct how the money will be spent, if my father can say what I will do with the money, and his word is final and binding, and he therefore directs how money is to be dealt with, then really it's as good as his money, it's as good as what he is doing. You can't then say, I am doing it. It's only he who is saying that this will go away directly somewhere else. So in that situation, it can't really be called a distribution by Company A, so it won't be a dividend. Will there be taxation of the shareholders under 56(2)(10)? They are getting shares of Company B of the resulting company without giving anything. They are not giving consideration for the same. So if you get something for free, and that is shares and securities, then section 56, which is gift tax in reverse, 56(2)(10), will then be applicable. The reverse gift tax, when I say reverse, what I mean is gift tax which is applicable to the donee, not to the donor. You are the donee, you are receiving the shares as a shareholder of Company A, and since you are not giving consideration, you are chargeable. That's one possible view of the matter. Is that correct? The other point of view is, no, it's not correct. I'm giving something as a shareholder. What I'm doing is I'm agreeing that the value of my shares of Company A will come down. Because if a whole non-ATIA unit is going away from the company, if it's not going to be part of the company, the value of the company is depleted. If the value of the company was 100 and this unit was worth 60 out of that, what is left is only 40. So the value is clearly depleted. I have lost 60. I have got shares of Company B, they are worth 60. Because that's exactly what Company B has allotted at fair value. If that be true, then really I have not benefited. I have not got shares for nothing. I have got shares by suffering a loss. Not actually giving something, but by suffering a loss on the shares of Company A. Is that suffering a cost? And the answer is yes. Supreme Court has said so in the context of a rights issue, Dhan Dadabhai Kapadia, that the fall in the value of the existing shares is the cost of the right by which you are entitled to subscribe for new shares of a company. So you had the rights issue of Reliance recently, and the rights were saleable at 200 or 300 rupees, different days, different prices. Why? Because the market price of the old shares was higher compared to the price at which the rights was being offered. That implied that the day the rights issue shares are allotted, perhaps there will be a fall in the value of the old shares. If they are quoting at 1500, they may come down to 1200 because there are more shares now in the company. That fall in the value of the old shares is the cost of the right. That's how the Supreme Court has looked at it. If there is no fall in value, and in Reliance there was virtually no fall in value, then of course there is no cost, but that's a different matter. That's in a listed share. In an unlisted share, undoubtedly the value of the company is going down. So that is a cost. Is that consideration? And therefore, will it be considered that 56(2)(10) does not apply? Because you are not getting the shares for nothing. You are paying consideration to get the shares. That's a gray area. There is no direct decision on the subject. One will have to look at it. In the context of a rights issue, Dand Dadabhai Kapadia has been applied by the tribunal in Sudhir Menon HUF's case, and in the context of a bonus issue in Dr. Rajendra Pai's case. Go on. So in a compliant demerger, as I said, all these tax questions will not arise. But if you have looked at what my views are that even in a non-compliant demerger, there is no capital gains tax, there is no dividend, there is no 56(2)(10). Tax questions arise, but the answer is they are not taxable. Here also the answer, if you do the compliant, the NCLT route, the answer is they are not taxable, but you can point to a section which says so. So when it comes to capital gains, 47(6)(b) says it is not taxable. When it comes to 56(2)(10), proviso to the section clearly says in so many words that in a case covered by 47(6)(b), you are not taxable under 56(2)(10). There is no deemed dividend. 222 again has a provision for that. Now the legislature has given a specific exemption from 56 for 47(6)(b). Does it mean that if they had not given this specific exemption, if the proviso were not be there, then it would be taxable? Because if you take that view, then the non-compliant demerger should be taxable. So if you say that the advantage is that this exemption is available, the section gives me a specific exemption, then are we saying the reverse? That if the section does not give it to you, you are taxable. If you take that view, then as I said, in the non-compliant demerger, you would come to a different conclusion. I would think the answer is no, it is not taxable. If it is not taxable, then why is the legislature giving you this relief? Why is there a specific section saying that 56(2)(10) will not apply to a demerger under 47(6)(b)? And I would say the answer is out of abundant caution, only for the sake of clarification, only just to give me comfort, they have added a section. It is an unnecessary section. Even if the proviso were not there, I would still not be chargeable. So alternatively, the answer is Parliament thought it would be chargeable. They believed it would be chargeable. And they said, we don't want to charge you, so we put it in the proviso and we will not charge you. And in that case also, I'm saying it makes no difference because the assumption of Parliament is not law. So just because Parliament thought it would be chargeable and give me an exemption, the first thinking of Parliament is not correct and is not binding. They are welcome to think it is chargeable, doesn't make it chargeable. And that's what we have the Supreme Court saying. The assumptions of the Parliament are not law. So this is not something which indirectly implies that a non-compliant demerger is taxable. Go on. Then in a demerger, therefore you can either do it through NCLT or you can do it by using section 180 and drafting your special resolution properly. Either way, you can achieve a transfer of the non-ATIA unit. And if you do that, you will also have a few GST issues and things like that. First, is GST chargeable? Answer is no. Second is the transfer of MAT credit and transfer of losses. Transfer of losses is not referred to in the slide, but equally relevant. If it is a compliant demerger, and that's the only thing for which a compliant demerger makes a difference, you can transfer any brought forward losses to the resulting company in a pro rata manner. That is why the section was introduced. It was introduced sometime in 97 or 98. The act is there from 61. Were demergers taxed before that? They were not. So you didn't need all the exemptions. The only thing you needed was the benefit which it gives of the carry forward of loss. Is there a carry forward of the MAT credit? That is a gray area. The carry forward of loss is written in the act in the context of a compliant demerger. It's provided for in section 72 capital A 4. There is no provision in respect of MAT credit. Personally, I would think MAT credit is a credit available to the demerged company. It's their right. And it's a right which is available to them under an act of parliament. And that is not something which you can assign and transfer and give to somebody else. And even if you give it to somebody else, income tax department is not going to give it to that somebody else. So that credit only you can enjoy because it's a personal right of yours. But luckily for us, the tribunal has in a number of cases held that it can go to the amalgamated company or resulting company. Merger, then amalgamated, demerger, then resulting company. So it's available according to them. If you don't transfer the MAT credit, it can continue to be used by the ATIA unit. So it should make no real difference there. The real question is, and this is the primary question which should have been raised, when we talked of trying to split the two units because of 115BAA. Why are you doing this whole thing? You are doing this whole thing because you want to take the lower rate 5% on the non-ATIA unit while continuing to enjoy ATIA benefits on the ATIA unit. The act, as it is drafted, does not permit you to do that. It says, make up your mind, either take the lower tax or take the ATIA benefit, but you can't take both. You want to take both, and that's why we are doing this. Therefore, it is clearly for a tax benefit. So GAR, primary reason, what is the main purpose of the demerger? Seems to be tax benefit. If that is true, is GAR applicable? The answer I would think is no. Two possible reasons. One is there could be other commercial reasons for the split. And in that case, the main purpose may be the commercial reasons. The commercial reasons can be, I'm looking at different investors. My bankers are looking at different structures. They want to give more loan to the ATIA unit, less to the non-ATIA, and so on and so forth. So investors, bankers, stakeholders, all of them can be a reason why you want to separate the two. So there could be commercial justification. Even if there is no commercial justification, the question is it got one of the four tainted elements which are necessary before GAR can apply? Is it a transaction not at arm's length? That's not true. We are talking about a demerger which would be at arm's length. Is it a transaction which lacks commercial substance? No. Now in place of one company, two companies will function, and each company will have its own business. It does not lack commercial substance. Is it a transaction done in a manner which is not bona fide? No. Amalgamations are done day in and day out. The law provides for them. There is a whole section and there is a whole tribunal sitting there to do that. Demergers, there is section 180 in the Companies Act. When the Act permits it, the Act provides for it, it is not something which you can say is mala fide. It's clearly bona fide. So that also is not in the way. So what is the fourth and the only possible tainted element which is relevant? Is it an abuse or misuse of the provisions of the law? Are you misusing the law? The law says if you have two things in one company, you must choose. Either take the benefit or take the lower rate. Don't take both. You can't. And I'm saying, fine, if that's what the law says, that if there are two things in one company, I can't take both. I will divide my company into two. And then I will take one thing in one company and another thing in another company. Is that a misuse of the law? Is that an abuse of the law? With great respect, I would think no. It would be an abuse or a misuse if I find a way to keep both of them together as one company virtually and yet take the benefit. So say post the demerger, I make such an agreement between the two companies, A and B, such that anything happening to A will hurt B and anything happening to B will hurt A. They give cross guarantees for each other. They are completely tied in. All bankers are joined. All stakeholders are joined. Then yes, you might say this is a misuse, because what you are doing is by the back door, you are saying that there are two companies. There are not really two companies. There is really only one company, and you are trying to take advantage in that one company. But if they are genuinely two companies, if you have gone through a demerger, the NCLT has found your case to be genuine and has granted the demerger, or your shareholders have accepted the genuineness and have given it under section 180, then I don't think one can say that this is an abuse or misuse of the provisions of the law. I am in fact creating two companies in place of one. Yes, I'm doing it because it gives a tax benefit, but I'm actually doing something. And if I'm doing something to get a benefit, that should not come in the way. Go on. So then coming to the alternative, this was merger or demerger. The demerger without ATIA is as good as a sale, but with one difference: the consideration goes directly to the shareholders. If the consideration is going to come to the company, it will be a sale. So we can do a sale. The reason to mention a non-NCLT demerger as one of the options was also that can be applied even to the ATIA unit, because that is not an NCLT based demerger. So section 12A will not apply. 12A will not apply to a slump sale also. So when it comes to slump sale, when you sell the unit, company A sells it to company B, then you can either sell the ATIA unit or you can sell the non-ATIA unit. Both the sales are feasible. Whichever you sell, you achieve the separation. The other company continues with the other unit. Easier to implement comparatively. Here also we can reduce the stamp duty. As we have said, in the context of a non-compliant demerger, as you can reduce it there, you can reduce it here. So this is next. The alternatives are the slump sale can be at book value. You can thereby avoid capital gains, or it can be at fair value. The sale can be to a wholly owned subsidiary. In that case, you will have the exemption under 47(4). The sale may be to another company which is not a wholly owned subsidiary. Then, of course, you are changing commercial terms. And in that case, that exemption will not be available. But because it is at book value, you may still avoid capital gains. on the simple logic that your cost and sale consideration are equal. So that works. Can you go do a slump sale through NCLT? It's a variation, but it's possible. So you draft a scheme, go to the NCLT, get an order. But the order is approving a sale, not approving a demerger. Consideration will come to the company, not to the shareholders. It's a sale. You have Salora's case, to which we have referred earlier but not dealt with, where that was the scheme. The consideration was to come to the transferor company, and in fact, part of it was to be retained by it. So that is the type of case where you can have slump sale through NCLT. So slump sale can be done that way also. It can be done at book value. In fact, it should possibly be justified to be done at book value if you are doing it to a wholly owned subsidiary, or you are doing it, as I said, in the non-compliant demerger to a company which is a mirror image. Now, if both the cases, the two companies would be under common control, the same people control both the companies. If it's a wholly owned subsidiary, because they are in line one below the other, and if it is, a separate company but common shareholders, then it's a mirror image. Therefore, you are achieving it. Common control. If it is common control, accountants who have gone to the heart of it have in fact, under Ind AS 103 in Appendix C, clearly provided that you will not even revalue your assets. You must continue to put them at whatever value they are in the books. So in short, the book value is considered reasonable way of implementing a restructuring where you are not changing fundamentally the owners, the ultimate shareholders, they remain the same. You are only doing a transfer from A to B, B to A, whatever you like, in between, keeping the same shareholders at the top. If that is true, then book value is commercially acceptable. GAR should not apply. But because it is book value, in that case, capital gains tax will not come. The other alternative is you sell it at fair value. Then there will be capital gains. The only way to avoid that is sell it to a wholly owned sub. There is the specific exemption under 47(4), but with the condition that if you are dealing before 8 years, then capital gains will apply. Next. One way out is slump exchanges, which we have discussed. When the other company allots shares as opposed to giving you cash, it becomes a slump exchange, is not covered by 50B. In the absence of 50B, an undertaking is not a taxable asset, is not liable to capital gains, should not be charged to capital gains. Why? Because the cost is not ascertainable. You cannot find out what is the cost of the undertaking. You can find that out in 50B cases because the section tells you what is the cost, but not in other cases. And if cost is not ascertainable, capital gain should not be chargeable. So you can avoid it still by doing a slump exchange as opposed to a slump sale. Another way of transferring and avoiding capital gains is gifting. Say you have taken a wholly owned subsidiary or a mirror image company and you gift the business, gift it away, either directly or again through NCLT, again through a scheme. In the gift, there is no gift tax and there is no capital gains tax because 47(4) exempts it. Now, if you do it at, 47, you don't need 47(4) because it's a gift is exempted under 47(3) also. So it's exempted. And nobody is the loser because it's a wholly owned subsidiary or a mirror image. Shareholders don't mind. So this is another way you can avoid capital gains. Go on. In the hands of the buyer, we have already discussed. In the hands of the company which is buying, 56(2)(10) will not apply because undertaking is not a property to which 56(2)(10) applies. There can be a question whether if you do it the way I mentioned earlier for stamp duty saving, you split on the records, on the documents, the movable property which is transferred by delivery and the immovable property which is transferred by a document. Is that a transfer of immovable property separately so that 56(2)(10) will apply? The answer is no. You may put a number in the conveyance document, but that number is put only for stamp authorities. That is not a transfer of the immovable property. For identifiable consideration, the consideration is not identifiable, not ascertained, not determined. And if there is no identifiable consideration, capital gains will fail. That's what Srinivas Shetty would say. That's the principle which has been accepted. And that is why 50B was introduced. But that would not apply to immovable property separately. So you cannot identify the consideration there. If you can't identify the consideration, you can't apply 56. To apply 56, you have to show that the consideration is inadequate. Or you have to show that there is no consideration. Here is a case where there is consideration. You can't say whether it is 10 or 100. The number is unknown, not identifiable, not ascertainable. In that type of situation, the section is incapable of applying the formula of Srinivas Shetty. Go on. Then, if the ATIA unit continues, it will be liable to MAT because it is not going for the lower rate of tax. It is not going for BAA, but that doesn't matter. It will take the MAT credit, use the MAT credit, and the day the MAT credit is over, that is the day it will shift to the 25% regime. We have said some time back it is not liable to GST. These are the reasons. There is a provision in GST law for transferring the unutilized ITC, the input tax credit. If you want, you can take advantage of it next. For being able to take advantage, there are a virtually number of rules, number of provisions. I've just enumerated them, but that's a compliance issue. So once you comply, you are entitled to the benefit. Yeah, next. So that's the one way of separating an ATIA and a non-ATIA unit using either demerger, slump sale, slump exchange, gift, variety of ways of separating the two. And we would feel that GAR will not apply to this because that separation is being done for either a commercial purpose or in any case is being done without using a tainted element. It would apply. For example, the second defense would not be available to a gift because gift between companies is not normal. It is abnormal. So it would be hit by that. But otherwise it should not be a problem in a normal case. Now coming to case study 2, so BAB, which is even better than BAA. BAA gives you 25%, BAB gives you 15% effective rate of tax, 17, along with the surcharge. So coming to BAB, let's see the case study. What we are thinking of is, say if you are setting up a new company today after October 2019, which has already passed, and you are going to do manufacture, you are entitled to this. One doesn't have to do any restructuring. One doesn't have to do any effort. But a number of people had projects in progress. It's an artificial date. Anybody before
Your screen has got freezed.
Anyways, that way, if you want to set up a new manufacturing company today, in any case, you are entitled to the lower rate of tax. So one doesn't have to do any restructuring. But if there were people who were in the process of setting up a project on the day when the act was amended, they will not get the benefit because those were existing companies. And this is a very artificial separation. I can understand a separation which says, even that, no real justification, that the manufacturing unit goes into production after October 19. And we will give you a benefit. If it has already gone into production, you will not get the benefit. As I said, no real justification except governments thinking that in any case you were doing it, so why should I give you a benefit? Somebody else who was not willing to manufacture, I'm making him manufacture by giving him a concession. As I said, not justified philosophically. Because if I did something good and you were happy with it, you can't say, but yes, you did something good, I'm very happy, but you please keep paying me at a higher price. And those others who are not doing good things, I will get them to do something good by giving them a lollipop. So I'm giving them a benefit, but not you. That's the current effect of this law, but that's the law. Now, if the law has come in this way, and the point is, what about those who were contemplating a project, who were not already in business? For those who were already in business, unfortunately, there is no solution. They cannot get the benefit of the lower rate. So they will continue, in a sense, for a lifetime paying more tax as compared to those who come in new and who are paying lower tax. For those who were on the borderline, those who had not started business is what we are talking in case study 2. So we are saying, for example, a company which was planning to set up, it had applied for land, it had entered into the know-how agreement, etc. A land parcel was almost allotted or is allotted to it, and it now wants to take advantage. Even though all this it had done before October and it was in existence before October. Next. What does it do? How does it become eligible to claim the benefit? Next. So what we are saying is, can this company effectively transform itself into a new company? So form a new company, say why? Form it after October 19, so you are taking care of that. If it is necessary, the shareholders, the memorandum, the articles can all be virtual mirror images, copies of the shareholders' memorandum articles of the existing company. Because as I said, you only want to transform yourself into a new company incorporated after October 19. Otherwise, you don't want to change anything. So all that can be copied. Another reason why doing this is, we are saying the old company was a joint venture. Naturally, all joint venture partners want to be sure of their inter se rights and obligations. So unless you copy it accurately, they will be uncomfortable. If you copy it accurately, they will all be happy. So in this case, Y Limited has got the same memorandum article, same arrangement as that of X Limited. Now Y Limited takes over the project. And that's what we are talking about. And next, how it takes over the land, etc. Next. So the whole project, the concept, the development which has been achieved up to the day on which the transfer is made should be transferred on arm's length terms. I'm saying. And why arm's length terms? To get over GAR also. So what is arm's length terms? For example, if there was a cost incurred by X Limited, Y will either reimburse the cost or may even pay a little more than the cost if you say, having got the allotment from Rajasthan government is a benefit and is an advantage which adds some value. Because anybody wanting to do it would normally have to wait for 6 months to 1 year. You are now saving that 1 year's time. So that's a benefit to you. Okay, you pay for it. So you value it, but take it over on arm's length terms. If you take it over on arm's length terms, the know-how agreements can be retransferred, etc. All that can be done. There will be, the land can be transferred, or you can give the land on lease. So you can give away the land, you will have regulatory issues. The Rajasthan government may ask you questions. So you'll have to convince them that it is permissible. You may have a small stamp duty cost. That's a cost worth paying for a lifetime of savings. There could be some delay. If you are able to manage your affairs well, there should be no delay. Transfer of a land should not have GST. Transfer of a know-how agreement, you would cancel the existing one, enter a new one, should have no real GST. But you will have to examine case by case. If there is GST, for example, lease rent will have GST, you will get the set off. The input tax credit can be claimed. So it's not an additional cost. It is an additional cash flow. But subject to an additional cash flow, not an additional cost, you are able to transfer it to a new company. And as I said, this is a lifetime benefit. So it makes a difference. Next. If you don't want to just transfer the project in the manner I said, you can even think of merging X Limited into Y Limited. Merger will require you to go through NCLT and all that. But in a sense, it will bind the Rajasthan government because merger is there. The NCLT is directing that the land be transferred to Y. The know-how partner he has no choice. The transfer from X to Y is happening because of the NCLT order. So he doesn't have a choice. He has to deal with Y. So it's become easier. So if there are a number of agreements where you can't go to the counterparty in each case and get into a fresh deal, then do a merger. That will take care of it. There you will be able to bind the counterparties in each case. Go on. The manufacturing activities can then be commenced in the new company. You will, of course, need NCLT approval. As we said, there will be some stamp duty cost, but manageable. Approval will take its own time. 3 to 6 months is indicative. It could be even 12 months. Next. The same thing you can achieve by demerger. This will be a non-compliant demerger because there is no existing business. So it's equivalent to what we spoke of earlier, the Section 180 type of case. It's a non-compliant demerger. Here there is no significant appreciation because we are talking about something which was still at a concept stage, a few things done, a few things not done. There could be a 10-20% appreciation. That's the only capital gains risk. And as we said there, it is not chargeable, it's a risk. But otherwise, the correct view in law is it is not chargeable, it's not taxable. So you should not really have a problem. Next. So we have explained the non-compliant demerger and the issues in the capital gains in the hands of the demerged company and why it is not taxable. As I said, up to 97, 98, it was never taxed. We have already explained this. The company gets nothing. It goes directly to the shareholders. In Salora, on the other hand, there was a scheme which said it comes to the company in so many words. If you say so in the scheme, naturally, you pay tax. So you have to draft your scheme carefully. You can't draft it the way it was drafted in Salora. So that was different. And there is only one stray sentence in Hindustan Unilever's case in Supreme Court. And that sometimes one wonders, is that stray sentence going to come in the way? Does it imply that the company receives it, not directly the shareholders? Because the issue before the Supreme Court was, is stamp duty chargeable on the court order giving the merger, directing the merger? The argument was it is not a conveyance because in a sense, no consideration flows back. It is something which is a vesting by virtue of a court order and the consideration is given direct to the shareholders of the transferor, not to the transferor. And in such a situation, stamp duty should not be charged. Supreme Court has there observed in that one sentence that it is as good as going to the company and from the company to its owners, the shareholders. So going directly to shareholders is as good as it having gone to company and from company to shareholders. That observation is there. Does it come in the way? Can it lead to a charge of capital gains and If capital gains, then deemed dividend and all of that. Because then company A has received and A has given to its shareholders. Or in this case, X has received and given to its shareholders. That would be the consequence. And that would be a troublesome consequence. I would think the sentence is in a different case, in a different context. It does not lay down the law. And that is not what one should read from the Hindustan Unilever case. So that should not be a problem. Next. So 56(2)(10 exempts a qualifying demerger. Whether it will get qualified here, I mean, we have already discussed this. It will not apply even on a non-qualifying demerger because there is effectively consideration in one sense. In the case, in here, the demerged company, there are 4 parties. What we are saying is demerged company gets nothing. If it gets nothing, then this question of 56(2)(10 cannot apply to it. The resulting company gets the undertaking, but it pays for it in shares. So even if first it is not in property specified under the Act, so it should not be liable. But even if it is liable, it is paying for giving consideration, there is adequacy. In MB Valley, the court has held in favor by saying it's a statutory vesting, not a transfer, but leaving aside that because all other courts in the context of stamp duty, etc., have taken it to be a transfer. I would not take MB Valley, I would take it as a straight decision of Delhi Tribunal, but they have given this view, it's a statutory vesting, not chargeable. So that's one more argument available. Next, the shareholders. As we have said, they suffer because of the fall in the value of the transfer or company, and Danda like by Kapadia has been discussed, and therefore they should not be chargeable. And the shareholders of the resulting company, they are benefiting, possibly. The value of their shares may go up because it's happening on good terms. But so what? It's only a benefit. It is not receipt of any property, not receipt of immovable property, of cash, or any other thing. And if it is not receipt of property, 56 should not apply. Next. So then, the real issue is the safeguard which is there in BAB. 115 BAB has a safeguard. The safeguard is you cannot do a reconstruction of a business already in existence. If you do that, the section will not apply. Now, what have you done? You had a project, conceptualized project, partly implemented, the land was acquired, the know-how agreement was there, but the rest was not yet implemented. And you transferred what you had. Is that reconstruction of a business already in existence? And therefore, will you fall foul of 115 BAB? And the better view is no. A business comes into existence, business, only when it commences. Till then it is proposed business, it's not a business. So business as understood under the Income Tax Act requires commencement. Commencement according to the variety of decisions would be correctly there only when you are ready to manufacture. When the plant is set up and you can press a switch and start it. You may not. For business reasons, commercial reasons, another 30 days, 60 days, 90 days may pass before pressing that switch. It is still a business which has already commenced. But it is something which is commenced because you are in a position to press a switch and start it. If you are not in that position, then the business has not commenced. If business has not commenced, you can't reconstruct something which is not there. You are reconstructing at the most the company, but not the business. And that being the position, there should really be no problem under the negative provisions of BAB or the anti-avoidance provisions of BAB. Next. Will GAR apply? We have discussed this also. And as I said, none of the 4 tainted elements are there. Arm's length transaction, commercial substance, bona fide means, The only issue being misuse or abuse. And to my mind, no. I think this is the objective of the section. That if you are doing a new manufacturing unit and you set it up in a new company, government says you are doing what I want you to do. You are complying with the two things. You have set up a new company and a new unit. You have done both the things I wanted you to do. I hereby give you the benefit of a lower rate of tax for your lifetime. That's what the government is saying. And that's what I'm doing. It's like putting money in PPF. Government says you put your money in PPF, I give you an ATC deduction. Is it an abuse of the law? Is it a misuse of the provisions of the law? No, that's what the government wants to do, me to do. And here the government says, these are the two things I want you to do. And I'm doing them. Where is the question of misuse or abuse? I don't think that should come in the way. They should not be chargeable to GAR also. Next. Then we have already discussed the disconstruction of business versus company. And the other test of the reason why, I'm saying once you get over the SAR test. Now what is the SAR test? The specific anti-avoidance in this case. The specific anti-avoidance is there should not be any reconstruction of a business already in existence. You are satisfying that because there was no business. So there can't be reconstruction. Now, when there is a specific anti-avoidance rule, by and large, the general anti-avoidance rule will not apply when you have complied with the SAR. To say that in that case also it is still an abuse or misuse, I think is going too far. I don't think that will apply. So I think one is reasonably safe in being able to do this. For all those whose projects were under conceptualization at that time and which have not yet commenced till today. In another 2-3 months onwards, this won't be something worth discussing because most of those projects would have commenced. Next. Now coming, these are the two sections which we want to use from an angle of taking advantage of the changes in the tax laws. Coming to Corona and COVID and deleveraging. What we are talking about is various concessions, restructuring of the financial side, which is going to become necessary because of Corona, because of COVID. Because you have had a lockdown which has lasted 2 months and a lockdown which has hurt you so much and which is going to keep hurting you because coming out of the lockdown is a slow process. It can't happen overnight. It is also a slow process because it is coming with a variety of safety norms. Those safety norms require you to do things in a different way. Social distancing is a fact of life for the foreseeable future. And I would say virtually forever. Because there are two routes. Foreseeable future, because let's assume there is a cure. And then you take the risk of falling ill only because you know that there is a medicine you can take the day you fall ill. There are quite a few people who say, I don't like to take the risk of even falling ill. I don't go and drink sugarcane juice on the street because I'm worried about jaundice. So there are those who take that precaution. There are those who don't take that precaution. So similarly, there will be those who will continue social distancing for life because Corona is a virus which can apply. And there are those who will say, okay, if at all Corona happens, I will take 2 tablets more. But things will change. And because things will change, business will be impacted. Because business will be impacted, we will have to restructure businesses to an extent to make them viable again in the new scenario and the new situation. And that's what we are talking about. Next. So we are saying, say, a company which was set up 3 years ago, which has raised loans in the ratio of 1:2, both from banks and from group companies. So it has taken something from banks, something from its group. It has been able to set up a fairly good business. But because it was a new company, it did not have huge reserves. It did not have a lot of ability to withstand adversity. And therefore, COVID and the lockdown has naturally hurt this company very badly. Its net worth is gone. And given the position that it has lost a major part of its net worth, it is thinking of how to deal with its debt. The solution is going to be go back to the banks and the group companies and ask them, please give me some concession. Either waive this loan, next slide. Either waive this loan or give me partial waiver or interest moratorium or some concessional loan, do something for me. Or convert it into equity or take a debenture, take a preference share in this place, again convertible, again at lower rate of interest or without interest. In short, you are going to go back, the company is going to go back and request for all sorts of reliefs. The question is, these reliefs, each of them will have a tax impact on the company which obtains the relief and on the lender, on the banker, on the group company which gives the relief. If some relief is given, some relief is bound to be given. The Reserve Bank has almost directed, not directed, but almost directed banks to give a moratorium for 6 months. It has, of course, said you make your own policy, but make a policy and give moratorium to those who fall within that. So it's a relief which Reserve Bank has suggested. The government has got various policies, and quite a few of them require the grant of relief by NBFCs, by others, and so on. So reliefs in a variety of situations are going to come in. You will have relief benefits coming from government by way of government assistance, coming from banks and financial institutions, and coming from friends, relatives, group companies, anybody else who has lent money to you. Let's look at what would be the consequences on both sides. We'll have to examine in this context very often whether it is an arm's length transaction or not. And the reason for putting up this slide or asking this question was, what is arm's length in this context? If benefits are being given because of COVID, because of the lockdown, because of the consequences, then would you say granting of waiver, granting of benefits is also an arm's length transaction? Would you consider that to be at fair value? And then will you have a threshold to determine what is the level of waiver you must give? And that if Reserve Bank has recommended 6 months moratorium, that is arm's length, but 12 months moratorium, which somebody else feels you need badly, is not arm's length? I think these are going to become key questions. Also, very important, because there is the question of testing the reasonableness of the benefit given to you. There will be questions vis-a-vis your foreign subsidiaries and where you are a subsidiary of a foreign company, and that foreign parent gives a benefit to the Indian entity, or the Indian entity gives a benefit to its foreign subsidiary. Will the arm's length rule come in the way? Because of transfer pricing, will the officer say, you may give the waiver, you may reduce 12% interest to 6%. I'll charge you at 12%. I'll make you pay tax on 12%. I will not take that into account. If you are recovering only half the loan, I will still charge you as if the loan is fully there. Or I will charge you as if your conversion is not at 10 rupees but at 2 rupees, because that's the current value. So all these are going to be key questions. Well, how is arm's length going to apply to concessions necessitated by circumstances, concessions which the government is telling you are required and is suggesting that you give, authorities are all telling you that you give, are another set of authorities going to say, but yet this concession was voluntary, nobody forced you to give, somebody recommended, you accepted the recommendation and gave, and if you gave, then it is not arm's length, it's something which you gave from your pocket, you are welcome to give, income tax department is not going to give, we will keep our pound of flesh by charging you as if you have not given. This is going to be a key question to shareholders for approval? Do you take majority of minority? Because this is a transaction with related parties, because it is a group company. Can minority shareholders throw away a benefit? Or can minority shareholders stop a group company from giving a benefit on the ground that the group company which is giving the benefit is not doing an arm's length transaction? On the face of it, it is not an arm's length transaction. How would you deal with it? Or would you say, no, giving certain benefits in this context is arm's length, and that will not come in the way? This is going to be one of the key questions. I don't know the answer. Only time will give us the answer. My own feeling is people will accept that concessions are part of life and therefore they are arm's length, but not extraordinary concessions, reasonable concessions, and reasonableness will have to be tested from case to case. Next. Now, given the overall time constraints, before we actually go into a variety of tax and company law issues, in particular on this, are there any one or two questions you would like to deal with today, or shall we leave that and stop this here? I'm sorry, because time constraints won't allow us to complete beyond this. They are all there in the slides, wherever you can go through them later on at your convenience.
Gautam bhai, there is a 2-3 questions so that we can complete the case study one with the queries and answer.
Yes, sure.
In your last case study, when there was a transfer of inventory and movable, what about the GST implication?
No, GST by itself, when you are transferring a business, there is no separate GST on inventory and movables or on any of the assets, because what you are transferring is a business. One of the points there, is the business a goods? And the answer is no. You had earlier decisions in the context of VAT, in the context of sales tax, clearly saying it is not goods. And those decisions remain good. It is an undertaking, and undertaking is not goods. The definition under GST, however, is a very peculiar definition. GST says anything which is not goods is services. GST does not have a positive definition of service. It has a very odd definition. So the moment you prove it is not goods, by definition, one could say it is a service. I don't think that is the correct way to read it, but that's the way the government is reading it, and that's the way it is perhaps intended to be read. That therefore anything and everything, every transaction is either a good or a service, and if you can prove it is not goods, it's a service. So you might as well pay GST as a service. The answer to that, luckily, is in the context of undertaking or business, government has understood that and government has given an exemption. But the exemption is given for business under service. But there is an exemption, so there would be no GST, and you would transfer the inventory and the movables separately, just like you would transfer the immovable separately, because all of it is really one transfer. As I said, you can't identify the consideration for the immovable. You can't identify the consideration for the movable. Each is part of one giant transfer, and there will be no separate GST on the movables, on the inventories.
Rest all the questions you have already answered during your presentation. If you would like to continue with this, it's fine, subject to your comfort.
As you like, if you like, we can continue for another 15-20 minutes. We'll stop. Okay.
Yeah,
we'll
fine.
Continue for, okay.
Yes.
Fine. Okay, so what are we thinking? The various ways in which concessions will be given. One is waiver or partial waiver of the loan. So what will happen? The borrower is clearly getting a benefit. Is he liable to tax on that benefit? Luckily, we have a direct Supreme Court decision in the context of similar waiver, which was given by the foreign joint venture partner who had supplied those goods and who was entitled to the price on that, or who had given a loan for the goods and who was entitled to a refund of the loan. The loan was waived. And the Supreme Court has said this is not taxable under 28(4) because they have read 28(4) to mean that it is a taxation of perquisites or benefits and not a taxation of a benefit in money. So if a loan of 10 lakhs is reduced to 6 lakhs, you have directly got 4 lakhs benefit. And because you have directly got 4 lakhs benefit, and the question before the Supreme Court was, is it taxable under 28(4) as a perquisite or benefit arising in the course of business? And Supreme Court says, what you can tax under this clause is something in kind. If a distributor has been given a foreign trip, 7 days in London, either alone or with his family, that is a benefit which he has got, and that we will value and add to his profits and charge him under 28(4) because the distributor was given that free trip to London only because of his business as a distributor. But if the distributor has been given 10,000 rupees as commission, that in any case is taxable as business income in the normal course, but in any case we will not tax it under 28(4). If it is not taxable under some other section, we will not tax it under 28(4) because that will not tax a cash benefit or benefit in money. Now this is what they have clearly held. We'll have to examine whether 28(1) will apply. Subject to that, this would reply. The other possibility is 41(1). First, the statutory sections which can come. 41(1) would apply if you have got a deduction in the past and you are now getting a benefit. In the context of a loan, you will never get a deduction. You borrowed the money. There is no expenditure. You don't debit a loan to the P&L account. You don't get it as an allowance. If there is no allowance or deduction, the waiver of the loan is not chargeable under 41(1). The department argued, okay, this is not correct. You used the loan to buy a plant. That plant was depreciated. That depreciation allowance we gave to you. So you indirectly got the reduction. The loan became a debit to the P&L. What else is it? In another name, it became via loan into plant and machinery into depreciation. And therefore, we should be able to charge you under 41(1) when you are now getting a waiver of this loan, because we gave you the depreciation and now you are really not paying for it. The court refused to accept that argument also and has taken the view that the two transactions are distinct and therefore the loan is a loan. It's a pure capital receipt, and being a capital receipt is not chargeable because there is no provision to charge it, and it is not something which is in lieu of something which was already given as a deduction or allowance earlier. Next. So in the past, courts have tried to distinguish this concept that loans which have not been deducted and therefore waiver of those loans cannot be taxed was always there. But courts have tried to distinguish between two types of loans. They have said loans on capital account, this is all correct. But loans on trading account, those which add to your business regularly, which effectively go and fund your inventory, that loan, when it is waived, it's as good as not paying a supplier. Because you could either take a loan from the bank and pay the supplier and tomorrow get a waiver of the loan, or keep the supplier unpaid and then get a waiver from the supplier. If you get a waiver from the supplier, you will pay tax under 41(1) because the purchase was debited to P&L. But if you get a waiver from the bank, you will not pay tax because that loan was never debited as a loan to the P&L. So the courts try to distinguish between the two. And you have, for example, the Bombay High Court in solid containers taking a similar view. In such a case, a trading liability is taxable. it should fall under 41(1) conceptually. So they have charged it. Similar position arose in Compaq Electric, where the High Court was in favor of the assessee and the department was in an SLP. There it was a company making losses. Those losses had to be funded by somebody. You could have taken creditors' money to fund it. And if you didn't pay the creditors, your losses would have gone because those would have been reversed. Instead of that, you took a loan from a group company, paid off the creditors, and then the group company waived the loan because you had no ability to repay the loan. The question was the waiver, was it a 41(1) case or not? Was it a 28(4) case or not? And the Supreme Court has dismissed the SLP. It's a SLP dismissal. It is not a considered decision. But it is not a simpliciter dismissal also. It's a dismissal with an observation. The observation is twofold. First, they say, not only is there no tax effect. So according to the Supreme Court, there is no tax effect. So that may be because losses were there or whatever else. So there was effectively no tax in that particular case. And secondly, they say, but in any case, the case is also fully covered by the decision in Mahindra's case. Now, Mahindra was capital loans, not a trading loan. Supreme Court was concerned with a trading loan which had funded losses in Compaq. But Supreme Court is saying it in so many words, but this case is also fully covered by the decision in Mahindra and Mahindra. If that be true, and the Supreme Court has said it, then even a trading loan should therefore be safe. So the borrower who gets a waiver, whether it's a loan on capital account or loan on trading account, whether it has funded losses, funded inventory, or funded plant and machinery, he will be safe. Broadly from 41(1) and 28(4). That brings me to the last question, which has not been examined by Supreme Court. It was not argued by the department. It is not something which has been checked. Forget the statutory provisions which go out of the way to tax such an item like 41(1) or 28(4). Why is 28(4) only for benefits in kind? For a foreign trip to the distributor, as I said, and not for monetary benefits. The only logic behind it could be that a monetary benefit is part of your profits in the normal course of business. How do you determine profits in the normal course of business? And the courts have consistently laid down that under 28(1), your profits and gains of business are chargeable, and those profits and gains of business are to be ascertained, are to be determined in the manner in which a commercial man would do it by applying the normal principles of commercial accounting. One of the decisions which reiterates that is this UP state decision, which reiterates that position that commercial accounting principles must apply. Now, if that be true, and 28 would tax it, then would you say this benefit, though in the capital field, is a benefit which must go to the P&L account? And if it goes to the P&L account, it should be taxable because it's part of your profits of business. So what I'm trying to say, even a capital item is ultimately profit in that sense. Should it become taxable under 28(1)? Gray area, I would say. I don't want to answer it. I only want to leave the doubt in your mind. Because luckily Mahindra is giving us total peace of mind, allowing us to sleep peacefully for all the borrowers who will get a benefit. But I don't think we can leave as peacefully as one would like to be, leaving a small doubt there on 28(1). Let's go ahead. Question is on the Compaq case, which I mentioned a little time back, that trading liabilities are safe. Is that it's a dismissal of an SLP? Is that binding case law? So you have clear this position that a non-speaking dismissal of an SLP by the Supreme Court is not binding in nature. But this is not a non-speaking SLP dismissal. There is that one sentence where the Supreme Court says not only is there no tax effect, but this is covered by Mahindra. So to my mind, the decisions which say that a non-speaking SLP will not bind, don't apply. This is a speaking decision. It will become a binding precedent. Second question could be obiter. It could be that Supreme Court didn't have to say this, because they have themselves said it is not necessary to say this. It is covered by Mahindra. They have started by saying there is no tax effect. That's why we are dismissing the SLP. If they don't have to say it is covered by Mahindra, and yet they say it, it's obiter. Now, is obiter good law? If any other court says it, if it gives unnecessary observations, those unnecessary observations are not a precedent. They don't have to be followed. What is necessary for the case, what the court decides, only that has to be followed. But in the case of the Supreme Court, the position is different. Any observation of the Supreme Court is law. You don't try to distinguish and say, okay, it was unnecessary for the Supreme Court to talk of Mahindra, whether necessary or not. If the Supreme Court talked of Mahindra, then that is binding law. And it's a binding precedent, it has to be followed. So if Supreme Court says in a case like this, it is covered by Mahindra, it's covered by Mahindra. So what it means is a trading liability case is also covered by the Mahindra decision. That's what it means, it's a binding precedent. Next. Then that's normal tax. MAT today, should we discuss at all whether this waiver of the loan will be liable to MAT? The reason why I'm asking it is, most cases you would be falling under 115BAA now. Most companies will shift to that. Certainly loss-making companies which don't have any other benefits which they are giving up, like ATIA, etc., will all shift to BAA. And if those who shift to BAA are not liable to MAT, they have 25% tax without MAT. And if they don't have MAT, then that's the end of it. So we don't have to really discuss MAT. But if you have to, the question is, does the waiver have to be credited to the P&L account, or can it be credited straightforward to the reserve? I think if the waiver comes from a bank, comes from an unrelated creditor, the better view is it must go into the P&L account. It is not something which must go directly to the reserves. That is the better view, but the Mumbai Tribunal in JSW Steel has taken a different view. They have gone at great lengths to understand the accounting principles and taken the view that this is a capital receipt and should not really be credited to P&L. They have looked at all the notes to account, schedules, what Schedule 3 requires, Schedule 6 as it then was, and so on. All these standards, and said, at the most you needed disclosure. At the most you needed a note explaining all this. It was not really necessary to credit this waiver to the P&L. The company credited it, by the way. And the auditors accepted that credit and gave a report saying it's true and fair. The tribunal has still taken the view that it was not really necessary to credit. And because it was not necessary to credit, even though it was credited, it is not liable to MAT. It's, of course, a highly concessional, highly pro-assessive view, if one may use that phrase. Welcome, something which one likes. One must be happy to have mercies in life. So nothing wrong with it. That's the law for the moment as per that decision. If you take the other view, in BNB Infotech, the tribunal didn't get into all this. They said, you have accounted, your auditor has approved, it's true and fair according to you and your auditor. We are not going to see whether you were required to credit or not. According to us, it is chargeable. So if it has to come into the P&L, it is part of book profits, it will be liable to MAT. This will only apply to those companies who are claiming some other past benefits and therefore are not giving up, not going for the lower rate of tax or continuing at 35%. They will still litigate on this in the context of MAT as to which of the two is correct. The best is, of course, don't credit to P&L, take it to reserves. The question is, though the tribunal has said so much in JSW Steel, is there an auditor out there who's willing to accept that and therefore take the view that it is not required to be credited to P&L and direct credit to reserve is still true and fair accounting and compliance with standards? I'm not so sure. Auditors are extremely afraid of all sorts of disciplinary cases, this, that, and everything, and therefore are becoming more and more conservative these days. And while according to me, they have strong support from JSW's observations of the tribunal, still I doubt if you will find auditors willing to give you a true and fair certificate. But if there is an auditor who gives it to you, then the best is don't credit it. You are even further safer in the matter. So you don't have to then worry about MAT. The other is 56.210. Is that applicable? This was a section which was not there in Mahindra's case because it was before 56.210 time. So this was naturally not before the Supreme Court. Can this section be invoked to charge the benefit? I would say the answer is no. 56.210 applies to a receipt. First, there has to be a receipt, either of money or of property or of immovable property. But it starts with the word receipt. Here you have already received the loan years back. The money came into your bank, was perhaps used up. That's why you are not able to repay. And that is why you are getting a waiver today. So because there is no receipt, not even a constructive receipt, to my mind, the question of 56.210 will not apply. The issue is, Supreme Court has in Mahindra's case, we are relying upon it for 41.1, for 28.4. You can't rely upon one part of it and doubt another. In any case, it is Supreme Court. So you like it or not, it is binding. And Supreme Court has said, it is a capital receipt. They have used the word receipt. So Supreme Court having used the word receipt, can we now argue that it is not a receipt? I think we can still argue. The question is it a receipt of property? Is it a receipt of a benefit? I would say it's the receipt of a benefit, not receipt of property. And 56.210 does not apply to receipt of benefits. And a waiver of a loan is not a property. So whichever way one wants to look at it, on the basis that it is not property specified in section 56.210, or on the basis that it is not a receipt, and receipt in this context must mean something different from receipt in the context in which the Supreme Court has used it in Mahindra's case. On either of those two arguments, it should not be liable under 56.210. So waiver, by and large, the borrower will pay no tax. On MAT, as I said, there could be a lot of litigation, but hopefully very few assessees will be hit by that. Next. Coming to the lender, what will happen? Does he get a deduction? It's equivalent to a bad debt. What is the difference? A bad debt is one where you try to recover, fail, and then finally say, this cannot be recovered. In a waiver, you are saying that upfront, that I don't want to recover because this recovery is so difficult that for me, it's better to waive it than to try to recover it. And that way I'm doing a positive act. So I would think it is available just as a bad debt is available, or in any case, a loss in course of business is available. So even if you don't call it a bad debt, it's a loss in the course of business. Supreme Court was concerned with a loss in the course of business in the form of, for example, there was theft, there was a fraud. Some dacoits came and looted a bank. Was that loss allowable? The money was lost because dacoits came and looted. Supreme Court said it's a loss in the course of business and therefore allowable. This is also a loss in the course of business. You had to waive in the course of business, bona fide, therefore allowable. For a group company, this might be a different question because are they in the business of money lending? Was this in the course of business or were they doing this more as shareholders, not as businessmen? And if they give you the loan as shareholders, because they wanted to assist you, they wanted to grow your business, then will this be allowable? Because they are not in the business of money lending and they gave you the loan not as a part of their business, but as part of their activity as a shareholder. But Supreme Court has in Essay Builders accepted that even such a loan coming from a group company, given by a group company to another, if it is given for advancing the business of the group as a whole, and the businesses are to some extent interconnected, then that loan is for the purpose of business. If it is for the purpose of business, then this is again a business loss and it will be allowable. But if it is not for the purpose of business, the group company may not be able to claim the loss. So while the borrower will not pay tax, even the lender may not be able to claim the loss. Whereas in a case of a bank, the lender will claim the loss, the borrower will still not pay the tax. There's a clear mismatch. The lender is saving tax, the borrower is not giving tax. That's the position. That's what is going to happen in most waiver cases, except for the two doubts which I have raised. One is MAT, the other is 28(1). Okay, I think let's stop at this point. Thank you. Thanks everybody for having heard me so patiently.